The dressing room door opened without a knock. That was the first sign something was wrong. Nobody walked into Frank Sinatra's dressing room without knocking. Not the stagehands, not the managers, not even his closest friends. But the three men who entered didn't care about protocol. They didn't need to. When you worked for Sam Giancana, doors opened for you, whether people wanted them to or not. Frank looked up from the mirror where he'd been removing his stage makeup. Chicago, November 1960. He'd just finished a performance at the Villa Venice, a supper club on the outskirts of the city. The show had gone well. The crowd had been enthusiastic. Frank was tired but satisfied, ready to head back to his hotel. Then he saw who'd walked in, and everything changed. Two large men in dark suits stood on either side of the doorway. Between them, impeccably dressed in a tailored Italian suit, was Sam Giancana. Not a big man physically, maybe 5'8", but he filled the room with a presence that had nothing to do with size. Sam had the kind of eyes that never blinked, the kind that had seen things, done things that most people couldn't imagine. Frank stood up slowly. "Sam, I wasn't expecting you." Sam smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's why I like to surprise people, Frank. Keeps things interesting." He gestured to his men. "Wait outside." The two bodyguards hesitated, then left, closing the door behind them. Sam walked to the small sofa against the wall and sat down, completely at ease. He pulled out a cigarette case, offered one to Frank. Frank shook his head. "We need to talk about a favor," Sam said, lighting his cigarette. Frank felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this moment was coming, had been dreading it for months. "What kind of favor, Sam?" Sam took a long drag, exhaled slowly. "The kind between friends. I helped you out. Now you help me out. That's how it works." Frank sat back down at his makeup table, trying to keep his voice steady. "I appreciate everything you've done, Sam, but I'm not sure what kind of help you think I can give you." Sam's expression didn't change, but something in the room got colder. "Don't play stupid, Frank. It doesn't suit you. I helped get Kennedy elected. Now Bobby Kennedy's got the FBI crawling all over me. I need that to stop, and you're gonna make it stop." Frank met Sam's eyes in the mirror. "I can't control Bobby Kennedy, Sam. Nobody can, not even his brother." "Then you better figure it out, because I don't take kindly to people who don't pay their debts." The two men stared at each other. The silence stretched, and Frank Sinatra, looking at one of the most dangerous men in America, made a decision that would change his life forever. "I don't owe you that kind of debt, Sam. I never did. To understand what happened in that dressing room, you need to understand the world Frank Sinatra came from. And you need to understand Sam Giancana, two men from the same Italian immigrant neighborhoods who took very different paths, but whose lives would remain tangled in ways that threatened to destroy them both." Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, in 1915. It was a rough, working-class city filled with Italian and Irish immigrants trying to make a living any way they could. Some worked legitimate jobs in the factories and on the docks. Others worked for the local organized crime families that controlled everything from gambling to protection rackets. Frank's father was a firefighter, a respectable job, but his mother, Dolly, was connected. She ran a speakeasy during Prohibition. She knew the local bosses. She understood how power worked in neighborhoods like theirs. And she taught Frank an important lesson. The world was divided into those who had power and those who didn't. If you wanted to survive, you needed to know how to navigate both sides. As a young singer trying to break into the business in the 1930s, Frank performed in clubs that were often owned or controlled by organized crime figures. That was just reality. The mob controlled the nightlife in most major cities. If you wanted to perform in clubs, you dealt with them. Frank was polite, professional, and careful never to owe them anything he couldn't repay. But over the years, some of these men became friendly acquaintances. They'd come see his shows. They'd send drinks to his table. They'd introduce themselves and tell him how much they enjoyed his singing, and Frank, who was charming and personable, would chat with them. He didn't judge. They were paying customers. They were fans. And besides, Frank understood these men. He'd grown up around them. He knew the rules. Sam Giancana was cut from a different cloth entirely. Born Salvatore Giancana in Chicago in 1908, Sam grew up in poverty so extreme it made Frank's Hoboken look like luxury. His mother died when he was young. His father beat him regularly. Sam turned to crime as a teenager, joining a street gang called the 42s. He was arrested for the first time at 17, and he discovered he had a talent for violence. By the 1950s, Sam Giancana had risen to become the boss of the Chicago Outfit, one of the most powerful crime organizations in America. Sam controlled gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and countless legitimate businesses that served as fronts. He was ruthless, intelligent, and completely without mercy. The FBI estimated Sam was connected to over 200 murders, though they could never prove any of them. But Sam had ambitions beyond being a gangster. He wanted respect. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate businessman, a man of influence, and he understood that in America, if you wanted that kind of status, you needed connections to power, political power, entertainment power, the kind of power that Frank Sinatra represented. Frank and Sam first met in the early 1950s, probably at a nightclub in Chicago. The details are murky because Frank always downplayed the relationship, but they knew each other. Sam would come to Frank's shows. Frank would acknowledge him with a nod. It was friendly but distant. Frank didn't want to get too close to someone like Sam. He'd seen what happened to people who got pulled into that world. Then came 1952, and Frank's career collapsed. His voice gave out. His movie studio dropped him. His personal life was a disaster. Frank went from being the biggest star in America to a has-been in less than 2 years. He was broke, desperate, and running out of options. During those dark years, some of Frank's mob acquaintances stayed loyal. They'd hire him for small shows. They'd lend him money. They'd tell club owners to give Frank a chance. Sam Giancana was one of them. Not because Sam was charitable, but because Sam was smart. He saw an investment. Frank might be down now, but he was talented. And if Frank came back, if he became a star again, well then Sam would have a very valuable friend. Frank did come back. In 1954, he won the Oscar for From Here to Eternity, and his career roared back to life stronger than ever. And Sam Giancana remembered the connection they'd had. In Sam's world, you didn't forget debts, you collected them. Throughout the 1950s, Sam would occasionally reach out. Nothing major, just friendly requests. Could Frank perform at this club? Could Frank introduce Sam to this person? Frank usually complied when the requests were harmless. He didn't want problems, but he also made clear he wasn't Sam's puppet. He had boundaries. Then came 1960 and the Kennedy campaign. John F. Kennedy was running for president, and Frank was all in. He was organizing fundraisers, performing at rallies, using every connection he had to help Kennedy win. And one of those connections was the labor unions, many of which were controlled or influenced by organized crime. Frank needed union support in key states, and in Chicago, that meant he needed Sam Giancana's help. So Frank called Sam and asked for a favor. They met at Sam's home in Oak Park, an affluent Chicago suburb. It was a nice house, the kind a successful businessman would own. Nothing about it suggested the man who lived there was responsible for hundreds of deaths. Sam welcomed Frank warmly. "Frank, good to see you. Come in, come in." They sat in Sam's study. Sam poured them drinks, and Frank made his pitch. "Sam, you know I'm working for Kennedy's campaign. We need union support in Illinois, Chicago specifically. I know you have influence there. I'm asking for your help." Sam listened, his face unreadable. "Why should I help Kennedy? What's in it for me?" "A president who remembers his friends," Frank said carefully. "A president who appreciates loyalty." Sam smiled. "And you think Kennedy's going to be loyal to me, to us?" "I think Kennedy understands how things work." Sam studied Frank for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, Frank. For you, I'll help. I'll talk to the unions. I'll make sure Chicago delivers. But Frank, you need to understand something. This isn't a gift. This is a loan, and someday I'm going to call it in." Frank felt uneasy, but he nodded. "I hope you do." Sam delivered. In November 1960, Illinois went to Kennedy by less than 9,000 votes. Chicago's returns were crucial. There were allegations of voter fraud, of ballot stuffing, of dead people voting. Nothing was ever proven, but everyone knew that Sam Giancana had kept his word. He'd delivered Chicago, and Chicago had delivered Illinois, and Illinois might have delivered the presidency. Kennedy won the election. Frank was elated. He'd helped elect a president. He was on top of the world. Sam Giancana was satisfied too. He'd invested in a winner, and now it was time to collect, which brought them to that night in Chicago in November 1960, just days after the election. Frank was performing at the Villa Venice, a club that Sam had a hidden interest in. After the show, Sam came to collect his debt. Sitting in that dressing room, Frank tried to reason with Sam. Sam, you have to understand, Bobby Kennedy is the Attorney General now. He's not going to back off because I ask him to. He doesn't like me. He doesn't trust me. If anything, me asking would make him push harder. Sam's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Then you better find a way to make him listen, because I helped you get his brother elected, and that means you owe me. I appreciate what you did, Sam, but I never promised I could control the Justice Department. That was never part of the deal. Sam leaned forward. Frank, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. I've been very patient with you, very understanding, but my patience has limits. The FBI is investigating my businesses. They're tapping my phones. They're following me everywhere. And it's because Bobby Kennedy wants to make a name for himself by taking down organized crime. I need that to stop, and you're going to stop it. Frank stood up, his own anger rising now. I can't stop it, Sam. I don't have that kind of power. Nobody does. Then what good are you to me? The question hung in the air. Frank felt the threat in it. Sam wasn't just asking what good Frank was to him. He was questioning whether Frank had any value at all. And in Sam's world, things without value were disposable. Frank took a breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Sam, I respect you. I'm grateful for what you've done for me over the years, but I'm not your employee. I'm not your messenger boy. I can't control the Kennedys. And even if I could, I wouldn't use that to protect criminal enterprises. That's not who I am. Sam stood up slowly. He was shorter than Frank, but in that moment he seemed to tower over him. Be very careful, Frank. You're walking a very thin line. I've been good to you. I've protected you. Don't make me regret that. Are you threatening me, Sam? I'm reminding you of reality. You came to me for help. I gave it. Now I need help. And you're refusing. That's not how friendships work in my world. Maybe that's the problem, Sam. Different worlds, different rules, different rules. Sam stared at Frank for what felt like forever. Then he smiled, a cold smile that made Frank's blood run cold. You're right. Different worlds. But Frank, you've had one foot in my world your whole life. You can't just pull it out now and pretend you were never there. Sam walked to the door, then turned back. Think about what I'm asking. Think about what happens if you keep saying no, and then call me. You have 1 week. He left. Frank stood alone in the dressing room, his hands shaking slightly. He'd just said no to Sam Giancana, and he had no idea what would happen next. Frank called Dean Martin the next morning. Dean flew to Chicago immediately. They met in Frank's hotel room. Dean, I'm in trouble. Dean listened as Frank explained everything. The Kennedy campaign, Sam's help, the demand for a quid pro quo, Frank's refusal. When Frank finished, Dean let out a low whistle. Frank, you know what Sam Giancana is capable of, right? I know. And you still told him no? What was I supposed to do, Dean? Become his puppet? Start doing mob errands? That's not a life. Dean poured himself a drink from the minibar. No, it's not. But it might be the life that keeps you alive. Sam doesn't take rejection well. I can't control Bobby Kennedy. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't. That's not going to matter to Sam. He thinks you owe him, and in his world, debts get paid, one way or another. Frank sat down heavily. What do I do? Dean thought for a moment. You cut all ties with Sam, publicly, completely. You make it clear to everyone, including the FBI, that you and Sam Giancana are not friends, that you have no business relationship, that whatever connection existed is over. That'll make him even angrier. Maybe, but it'll also protect you legally. Because Frank, the FBI is watching you. Bobby Kennedy is watching you. They know about your connections, and if you don't distance yourself now, you're going to go down with Sam when they finally get him. Frank knew Dean was right, but he also knew what it meant. Cutting ties with Sam wasn't like ending a regular friendship. It was a declaration, and declarations had consequences. Over the next few weeks, Frank made his position clear. He stopped taking Sam's calls. He stopped visiting clubs where Sam had interests. He told people he barely knew Sam, that they'd met a few times but weren't friends. Word got back to Sam, of course. Everything got back to Sam. In early 1961, the FBI called Frank in for questioning. They wanted to know about his relationship with Sam Giancana. Frank told them the truth, more or less. They'd met. They'd had some interactions. But Frank wasn't involved in Sam's business. He was a singer, not a criminal. The FBI didn't believe him, but they couldn't prove otherwise. They showed him photos of him and Sam together at various clubs over the years. Frank explained them away as casual encounters. The FBI agents looked at him with disgust, but they had to let him go. Frank thought maybe he'd navigated the situation, maybe Sam would move on, maybe the worst was over. He was wrong. In 1962, Frank owned a resort called Cal Neva Lodge on the border of California and Nevada. It was a beautiful property with a casino, a showroom, and a hotel. Frank had invested heavily in it. It was one of his proudest achievements. One night in July 1962, Sam Giancana showed up at Cal Neva. He didn't ask permission. He just arrived with his girlfriend, Phyllis McGuire, and checked into one of the luxury bungalows. Frank found out the next morning and immediately went to confront Sam. "Sam, you can't be here. The Nevada Gaming Commission has you on the blacklist. If they find out you're on the property, I'll lose my license." Sam smiled. "Then I guess you better make sure they don't find out." "Sam, I'm serious. You need to leave." "I'm on vacation, Frank. With my lady, we're paying customers. Or are you saying my money's not good here?" "It's not about money. It's about the law. You're banned from Nevada casinos." "Then it's a good thing half this property is in California." They argued, but Sam wouldn't budge. He stayed for 3 days. And someone, probably someone who worked for Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department, made sure the Nevada Gaming Commission found out. Within weeks, Frank was called before the commission. They accused him of harboring a known criminal. Frank tried to explain that Sam had shown up uninvited, that Frank had asked him to leave, that it wasn't his fault. The commission didn't care. They revoked Frank's gaming license, forced him to sell his stake in Cal Neva. Frank lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, years of investment gone, because Sam Giancana had decided to make a point. Frank was devastated and furious. He called Sam one last time.
"You destroyed me, Sam. Was it worth it? Was making your point worth ruining my business?"
Sam's voice was cold. "You destroyed yourself, Frank. I asked for a simple favor. You said no. You cut me off. You embarrassed me. This is what happens when you forget where you came from." "I didn't forget where I came from. I just refused to become what you wanted me to be. Then you made your choice, and choices have consequences." Frank slammed down the phone. That was the last time they spoke. Over the next decade, both men's fortunes changed. Frank continued to perform, to make records, to be Frank Sinatra. But the Cal Neva incident haunted him. The FBI never stopped watching him. Bobby Kennedy never stopped suspecting him. Frank's connections to Sam Giancana, no matter how much he tried to distance himself, became a permanent stain on his reputation. Sam's situation was worse. Bobby Kennedy's war on organized crime focused heavily on the Chicago outfit. Sam was subpoenaed, investigated, harassed. The pressure was relentless. Sam's power began to erode. Younger mobsters questioned his leadership. By the early 1970s, Sam Giancana was a shadow of what he'd once been. In 1975, Sam was called to testify before a Senate committee investigating CIA connections to organized crime. There were rumors Sam had been involved in plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Sam was scheduled to appear, but he never made it to Washington. On June 19, 1975, Sam Giancana was at his home in Oak Park, the same house where he'd met with Frank 15 years earlier. He was in the basement, cooking sausages. Someone he knew, someone he trusted, walked down those stairs and shot him 7 times in the head and neck. Sam Giancana died on his kitchen floor. The murder was never solved. Most likely, it was a mob hit, ordered by people who were afraid of what Sam might say to that Senate committee. The life Sam had lived, the power he'd wielded through violence and fear, ended the same way. When Frank heard the news, he was performing in Las Vegas. Someone told him between shows. Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Sam lived by the gun. He died by the gun. That's the life he chose." Later, in private with Dean, Frank was more reflective. "I knew Sam was dangerous. I knew getting involved with him was a mistake, but I thought I could manage it. I thought I was smart enough to take his help without becoming his property. I was wrong. You survived, Frank. A lot of people who got close to Sam didn't. I survived because I said no, because I was willing to lose everything rather than become his puppet. But Dean, it cost me. Cal Neva, my reputation, years of the FBI watching my every move, all because I asked Sam Giancana for help winning an election. You didn't know what Kennedy would become. You didn't know Bobby would go to war with the mob. I should have known better. I should have known that once you owe Sam Giancana, you never stop owing him. Years later, after Frank had died, Dean Martin did an interview where he was asked about Frank's mob connections. People always wanted to make Frank out to be a gangster, but he wasn't. Frank was a kid from Hoboken who grew up around tough guys and learned to navigate that world. But Frank never crossed the line. He never became one of them, and when Sam Giancana tried to make him cross that line, Frank said no, even though it could have gotten him killed. Even though it did cost him dearly, Frank said no, because Frank Sinatra was nobody's puppet. Not the mob's, not the government's, not anyone's. Frank never forgot who he was. He was a singer, an artist, a performer. He wasn't a criminal. And when Sam Giancana tried to turn their casual acquaintance into something else, something that would have required Frank to compromise himself, Frank refused. That refusal cost Frank money, prestige, peace of mind. It brought FBI investigations and public scrutiny and lost opportunities, but it saved Frank's soul. Because if Frank had said yes to Sam that night in Chicago, he would have become Sam's property. He would have spent the rest of his life doing favors for the mob, getting deeper and deeper into a world he could never escape. Frank chose differently. He chose to pay the price for his independence, and he lived with the consequences, both the bad ones and the good one. The good one being that he got to look at himself in the mirror and know that he'd never betrayed himself, that he'd never become anyone's puppet. Sam Giancana didn't have that luxury. Sam spent his life accumulating power through fear and violence, and in the end, that same fear and violence consumed him. Sam died alone on a kitchen floor, murdered by people he'd thought were his friends. Frank died in bed, surrounded by family, mourned by millions. Not because he was perfect, not because he'd never made mistakes, but because he'd maintained his independence. He'd refused to be controlled, and he'd paid every price necessary to remain Frank Sinatra on his own terms until the end. That's the real story of Frank Sinatra and the mob. Not a tale of Frank as a gangster, but a tale of Frank as a man who understood the rules of a dangerous world and chose at the crucial moment to break those rules rather than break himself.